Welcome. I'm Jim Tolles. Today we're going to be talking about feeling split from your ego. It's a common experience that a lot of people have. And I feel like it's really important to understand what we're talking about in terms of the ego, this split. Probably going to touch on very briefly some ideas of mental health and how this differs from like an actual issue. I'm not going to go into much depth on that because I don't pretend to be a psychologist, and I strongly encourage people to see psychologists and therapists as an important piece in the inner work that many people do. It seems like a lot of people try and skip steps and try to like jump ahead or find a spiritual solution and neglect important parts of their work, and therapy at times is one of those pieces. If you're brand new to me, I'm a spiritual teacher. I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. And I often do these talks thanks to everyone who has donated to make this talk possible. I also have another talk coming up in 2 weeks from now at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. As people are logging on, feel free to say something in the chat pod. You can let me know what country or state you're in. It's kind of fun to see where people are, since this reaches people all around the world. I'll usually free flow, just kind of sharing what comes to me for the first half hour of this talk. And then I'll get into questions people have, and you can type those questions in the chat pod. And please keep things directed to me. It's a small area, so if there's a lot of chatter between people, there's just stuff that would get lost. Welcome, Marta. Tulsa, Oklahoma. Cool. I'm here in Nevada, for those who want to know. A western state in the U.S. So let's begin. Just a brief overview. What is the ego? The ego, when I talk about it, is a collection of beliefs and ideas and past experiences that we smush together into a personality that we call ourselves. And we're so used to experiencing life through this lens, this filter, that we don't realize that there's another way that we could be experiencing life or be interpreting life. And that's really kind of the basis of it. And there's a lot of beliefs that we've forgotten, a lot of past experiences that we've forgotten that are kind of part of this lens, this filter. But when we're completely identified with it, we have no idea about most of those things, and we believe whatever we think we believe. So all sorts of beliefs about what's right or what's wrong, or who we should be, what we shouldn't do, all those types of things are just so embedded, so immersed in ourselves, and we're so identified with it, that we don't realize we can think or see life differently. The more identified somebody is with their ego, the less flexibility they often have in seeing and understanding life in different ways. This is obviously very problematic in relationships, in the inner workings of countries and the interworkings of countries, when you get people are so lost in their identification that they can't see another point of view, right? There's no way to compromise, no way to work things out, and that's a big problem. And most people will spend their entire lives completely identified with their ego and not know that there's another way that they could be acting. Then something happens for some people. Maybe it's some sort of glimpse of the divine, some sense of oneness or openness. Maybe it's something that's kind of tragic or a near-death experience. And suddenly that tight grip that we have on ourselves with our ego identity gets loosened, and there starts to be this little bit of separation, and suddenly there's a sense of something that's watching something else that's thinking or doing. So suddenly there appears to be a kind of split. Now, as I said at the very beginning, as people are logging on, I'm not a mental health expert, and that's actually a really important part of a lot of people's journeys in the spiritual path, is to engage with a therapist and to understand their minds. And there are certainly a lot of delusions that people are in that they want to find a spiritual thing to say, oh, this is a spiritual thing or whatnot. But one of the things I would point people towards is that the awareness, when we're going through a true spiritual shift, the awareness isn't a new personality and it's not a competing personality. It's just there. It's just observing what's happening in the mind now, where before there was no real observation of what was happening in the mind, not in any particularly deep way. Obviously, people have think about their thoughts, but this isn't a thinking about your thoughts situation. So to me, that's very different versus, like, I'm sure there are other mental health things where there's just different subsets of the mind that are competing with each other. That's not a healthy thing. So just in general, when in doubt, if you're concerned about your mental health, then talk to a therapist. That's what they're there for. But one of the biggest keys as we're stepping into understanding this process, and it can be quite jarring for a lot of people because you've been so immersed in what you thought you were, suddenly realizing that you're not that we can make a lot of bad assumptions about what's happening. But the key point here is that this awareness isn't really doing anything. It's not making you become anything. It's not making you think about anything. Actually, it's just watching that you're thinking. It's just kind of there all the time. And it can be kind of strange to notice that there's this kind of sense of presence that's there observing all this other stuff. And I spend a lot of time with my students, as some of my students who've logged on know. It's like, I keep pointing you back. Go back to awareness, go back to awareness, go back to awareness, to continue to break this connection, this attachment and identification with the ego, and which in an interesting way starts to kind of exacerbate this sense of split. It starts to get a little bit worse. And the way the body responds becomes more dramatic in certain ways. But kind of stepping back to these initial points, because this is when people are most likely to really get upset and scared, right? Where there's so much more identification. And you don't realize that there's a different way to experience life. And you're not going to relax into awareness yet. You're going to try and cling back onto this sense of identity, that this is who I am, this is who I've always been. How can I not be this way or think this way? Even though there's now this little bit of separation. And people can jump to conclusions that they're losing their mind. They can jump to really crazy things like, I'm being possessed. It's like, no, you're just now observing that you've been possessed by an ego, not a spirit. It's just, this is who you thought you were. And now you're starting to see that you actually don't have to be that. That leads to other questions like, well, then who am I? Which is actually a really good question. But usually when people say it at that point, is they are now desperate to find a new identity. I recently updated a blog post that's very, very old. And it's called Beware the Spiritual Ego. Simply because at little moments like this, when there is this split starting to happen, or this realization that you're not the ego, right? So the idea that there's even a split is kind of a fiction, but that's how it feels, okay? So that's what I'm speaking to. I'm not necessarily speaking to the ultimate reality. I'm speaking to the feeling of no longer being completely identified with your ego. So I recently updated Beware the Spiritual Ego, and you can find that blog post after this. And it kind of points to how we immediately want to put on new clothing. It's like the split is kind of starting to peel off this layer of identification, and a part of us is getting a little cold, a little chilly, it's a little nipply, and we're like, I don't like this. So we immediately put on like a new set of clothing, a new ego self, and that's how a lot of spiritual egos are made. And we have this idea that we've made something that's better. Maybe there's some level of increased conscious awareness, maybe not. But ultimately, it's just creating a new fiction that we're going to try and hold on to and identify with and use it to protect us from the vagaries of life. And all I mean by that is life has its ups and downs. Doesn't matter how spiritual you think you are or what you do or how you pray. People get disease, they have accidents, all kinds of things happen. And that's totally outside of our control, which is another thing that a lot of egos don't want to accept. And so there becomes this time once there's a split of searching for many people, because now something's not so certain, and that searching, as I mentioned, often leads towards looking for an ego, something that's they can put on to cover up the sense of vulnerability. it's not the purest reason to start in the spiritual path, but it happens. And most of our reasons when we start in the spiritual path are generally not particularly pure. Pure in the sense that we're not clear about them, pure in the sense that they are still very much self-serving. We're trying to still serve the ego self. We're not really trying to dissolve and be free. And most people have no idea what is spiritual freedom. The idea of being free of ego suffering kind of sounds good, but most people don't know what that means. So a whole exploration is a natural output of this split, hopefully. As I said earlier, it's like people will get very scared by this. They'll get very upset. They'll look for ways to try and hide themselves again, get safe again. And that makes them very vulnerable to manipulation. Sadly, there are false teachers out there. There's all sorts of ways that other people will try to manipulate somebody in this state of vulnerability. The beautiful part about this spiritual path of coming into ourselves and coming into awareness is that space actually doesn't ask you to be or do anything. So it's not demanding. What you're going to notice is how much your own ego puts demands on you. Once again, telling you this is how you should be, how you should act, how you should think. It's constantly talking to you. Right now, there are plenty of egos for the people who are watching me that are telling you whether to agree with me or disagree with me, whether you understand, whether you're confused. And all this is kind of going on and kind of distorting what you're hearing from me. Fortunately, this records, so I recommend re-listening to this talk later on if you're having any particular trouble, just to check in as like, what was the filter going on that was trying to distort some of the things that I was saying. And this kind of points to a certain level of, it's not necessarily distrust, but skepticism we start to have about our own ego, about our own thinking, to say, okay, what is this thought? What are the beliefs that underpin it? That's how we start to investigate. We stop believing our beliefs. Sounds kind of funny, right? But if we have this belief that we should be attractive in some particular way, well, then what we do is we turn it around and say, actually, why? Why is that important? And then you'll come up with a couple of answers, and then you can question that one and say, well, why is that important? To start to be an onion peeler, to peel away these layers, to get closer and closer to figuring out what is going on in here? What's happening? What have I been taught to believe? And does it have anything to do with reality? And a lot of times you'll find out it doesn't. And each time you find out some new level of realization, because realizations start to become possible. And the spiritual realization is a word I love because of that root word of real. We are discovering or remembering something that is real. We are not creating a new belief about something. I often like to express that spiritual truth is like gravity. Somebody else can point out to you, oh, there's this gravity, there's this thing that's going on in life, and you can prove that. You don't have to believe them, so you don't have to believe me. But it is important to be sincere and skeptical of your beliefs, to not assume that you are looking at life through a clear lens. And if you're sincere, what happens is you have these realizations, and they drive you towards acceptance. If you can accept the next level of what you realize about yourself and about life, then you can continue to grow and proceed, and it will make the split wider. So there's a way you start to let go of those attachments and you start to step back further, and that gives you more awareness about what you actually think is you. And it's important to keep the focus on yourself, not life. This is a very common thing too with ego splits, where somebody steps back and they know they're no longer an ego, and it gets easier to see everybody else's problems. Well, that's never been difficult for most human beings anyway. To figure out what's wrong with somebody else is kind of one of the lowest levels of conscious awareness in terms of understanding. It's like, is it important? Yeah, because there are certainly issues that people are acting out and responding from. But that's where a lot of people get stuck, because it is so much easier to just point out everybody else's flaws constantly versus to go inside and to find our stuff. Most of the other stuff that's going on with people, unless it's a near and present danger, right? They're going to harm themselves, or they're going to harm you, or harm somebody else. It doesn't really matter what other people are thinking. And most of their actions are relatively benign. So we come back to ourselves, and we just keep coming back to the space of awareness. And when I talk about awareness, I talk about it constantly. It's just a space of observing. That's it. It's not if you feel good. So you can't lose this space of awareness. It's just there. And each time you come back, it's kind of like you're breaking down another attachment inside you a little bit more. And it's not always clear what we're breaking down at the time. So there's a lot of faith that people cultivate, particularly early on when you don't really understand what's happening. To sort of trust this breaking down that's arising within. If somebody has a spiritual awakening or Kundalini awakening, which is part of that, and you've got the energy doing that for you, that's nice, but that's not usually what's happening for people. And so dedication is important. It's still important for somebody who's had an awakening. You've got the energetic push throwing you through egoic walls and smashing attachments for a while. But dedication is so key because we like to go back to our habits. We like to go back to our patterns. We associate patterns and familiarity as safe. And coming into a split like this is brand new. And so it's going to be labeled unconsciously in your own minds as unsafe, as something to get away from or to be scared of. It happens so often. I mean, I've got so many conversations and so many emails, and people are just like, oh my God, what's happening? I don't know who I am anymore. Yes, that's good. You actually don't know who you are, and you have to come into acceptance of that. And in doing so and doing this work, the split gets wider, and you'll start to notice when you go back into the ego, when you re-identify, because you'll start to feel it. Right? The more we step away from it, when we go back in, you start to feel how it's kind of a tense place. It's not actually very safe. The more we relax into that space of awareness and we're just here, we're just in that space of being, the body, heart, and mind tend to calm down a lot. And so what happens is you'll notice when you go back into trying to be an ego, the body, heart, and mind start to tense back up. They start to get agitated and uncomfortable in different ways because the ego spends so much time in agitation. Fear and desire are very agitating states. And, you know, there's also the lethargy thing, too, that can be there, too, where somebody who's just not really been able to do a lot, not have a great sense of will and that sort of inner strength, well, they kind of sink. Right? So going back into the ego becomes heavy. So that's probably going to be more of the defining term, rather than there's a lightness to just being. But each time we go back in, that now becomes an opportunity to think about this, right? Now we're coming in with a little bit more awareness. Okay, I have re-identified. Do I want to stay here and feel heavy or agitated or tense? What have I been drawn into? What was the ego hook that grabbed me back? That made me say, oh, I have to do this, to think this way or be this type of person, to do what? Get something, protect something, get rid of something, avoid something. Those are kind of the ego's four main functions when you break them down. It's like we're either getting something or avoiding something, protecting something, or getting rid of something. Space of presence is just being. It's not taking any particular action. I think it is really important to just pause and say that if you feel split from your ego, that's not a bad thing. It's actually a really good thing. It means there's a level of awareness now where before there was not. And this split, it really does feel like it keeps getting wider and wider, and then things get quieter. They get quieter because we're losing interest in being an ego, in trying to manipulate ourselves or life to do the acquiring, to the protecting, the avoiding, the getting rid of. So this quietness, it's also very deeply relaxing for the body. And we generally like that. And if we can start to touch into that space, then we really want to keep going on the path. But it's really these earlier phases that are very, very tricky for a lot of people, because we're not really immediately given a whole bunch of good experiences. And if somebody did have an initial good experience, a bliss experience, a oneness experience, or something along those lines, it's usually gone about the time they start to realize there's a split from the ego. So for a while, they just kind of got an ego, an ego exception. You got to get to leave it for a little while and not be a person. All kinds of feelings come up too, partially because we're now paying attention. When you have these moments of split, you start to see levels of sadness about yourself that you didn't want to accept before, but because there's now this separation, they can't hide as much. When you're completely immersed in something, you can't really get perspective on it, right? If you're completely immersed in a swamp, you don't really know the full extent of the swamp. You're just in mud. So the minute somebody pulls your head out of the swamp and you start to look around, it's hazy and weird and you're not used to seeing outside the muddy thing, but you're getting some perspective. One of which being, I've been drowning under mud and swamp water for the last 15 years of my life, or 20 or 25 or 50, right? And we have to accept that. Right? So this acceptance is just such a central key to like being with any sort of split like this. And I want to emphasize, like, we're not creating new ego, and it's not like now you've run into something that's telling you to do bad things or anything like that. That would be something else entirely. The space of awareness does not care. It's just there, and it gives you the freedom to just be as you are. There's no agenda with it. And maybe this is a good moment right now as you're sitting here with me to just pause. Think about what it would be like if you had no agenda for yourself right now, that you can just be entirely as you are. You don't have to think about how to do that. You can just be. And take a few deep breaths. There's nowhere to go. Me giving you more ideas doesn't actually bring you closer to being. It's just kind of inspiring you to allow yourself to surrender to that space, actually. The Western ego is often thinking, I just need more ideas, or the right ideas. It's like, it's not going to matter. Right? They're just inspiration, encouragement. And that space of being is just the observer, just the awareness. It's not what you're thinking. It's not a doing. It doesn't matter if you feel good or not when you put your attention there. Right? Just putting your attention there is acknowledgement that here is the space of being. And you'll notice it's just there. That's it. It's really simple. A lot of times people are making this complicated, and that's how they get confused, and they make presence into an experience. The minute you make presence into an experience, you've chosen one little tiny dot in the infinite universe of dots as the thing you're supposed to have, which means you absolutely will lose that presence, right? Because you've created it as an idea of an experience. Experiences all come and go. The observer's part of us observes all that coming and going. It doesn't resist. It completely accepts it all. And that's the space I point you back towards. And particularly when we first have these experiences of split, of breaking away from our identification with our ego, it's really important to know that. To just, okay, here is this split and stuff is happening. And I don't necessarily fully understand, but I'm just going to breathe and relax and observe and see what I start to see. From that observer, we become very, very smart, because we start to want to look at reality rather than the fantasy that the ego is projecting. Fantasies about who we are, about who our family should be, about how people should respond to us positively or negatively or whatever, and whatever positive or negative means. I'm sure some of my students tonight have heard their own ego say that Jim's being mean to me at some point in a session, right? And that's their ego misinterpreting help and support because it's not hearing the story it wants. So negative and positive, good and bad, those ideas are very corrupted by the ego because they're usually been things that were just accepted from others And we twisted it to mean whatever we think benefits us, even when we don't really know what benefits us. That's what gets really crazy. The longer you pay attention and just observe and allow this split to be there, you start to realize how little you understand yourself and that you're pretty wrong about what should happen in a lot of parts of your life. I'm sure many of you have had difficult scenarios come up that actually helped you. They made you stronger in some way, smarter, more compassionate or something. But if you'd asked the ego before that event came, it would say, nope, don't want that. Don't want to do that. Thanks. I'll pass. Right? And then that opportunity for growth and strength would have not come to you. A willingness to accept. This is kind of one of the key points tonight. A willingness to accept is vital. If you don't accept what's going on, you're going to resist. And when you resist, that's when all the problems get worse. It forces you to try and control yourself and to control life. And it's basically just stacking marbles and hoping that they'll stay together. Sometimes people are lucky for a while. Life plays nice. And other times they're not so lucky. But life is going to keep doing whatever it wants to do. The illusion that we can control it all and give ourselves the 5 to 10 experiences that we want out of life and avoid all the stuff we don't and just assume that these are the best 5 to 10 experiences we can have is nonsense. It's arrogance of the highest order. And we don't even realize how arrogant we are because we're so immersed initially with our ego self. So humility comes with a stepping back to just be the awareness, to be with the strange feelings of the start of the split and the breaking down of the ego. We're saying, you know what, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm going to surrender to it. I'm going to just allow it to arise and see what I see. What do I see about myself? It's powerful stuff. That will scare the ego then. It'll say, oh no, this is too much. I can't handle this. It's overwhelming now. The ego is constantly upset about something, and knowing yours is important. So I speak in a lot of generalities, and I'm sure it touches some of your experiences and others it doesn't, but this is why it's important that you're honest with yourself too. So the honesty in this part of the work is also vital. It's honesty and humility. It's the same things you've heard me say before, but I can't emphasize it enough. You have to be honest to know yourself, because otherwise your ego is looking for a way to get out of being worked on, get out of being illuminated or shown to be false. And we do this again and again. You have to know yourself. You have to know your own issues, how you try to bargain your way out of things, because then you can catch that. And that becomes your little signs that something's up, something that you need to explore and to learn about. So again and again, this makes us sharper and sharper in staying in awareness and clearer, so that we don't get caught up in this identification and try and fool ourselves into a new game, into a new spiritual ego. So I see I already have some questions here, so I think I'll move over to those and let other people who may have questions feel free to type in the chat pod. Just keep it directed to me. It's a small space. Once again, thanks everyone who's donated for these talks. I appreciate it. I'll be doing another one at 10:30 a.m. in 2 weeks. That's July the 11th. So I hope you can join me if it works for your time zone. And if you want to donate to a second July talk, there's a donate link down below. And that's how this work happens. So if you're enjoying this for free and you can't donate, that's okay. Other people have taken care of me, so I can take care of you. And you can just offer gratitude to them and your thoughts for being so kind to me. So we have from Paul, when the split gets further, why doesn't love move in? I know that I'm very aware, but emotionally, bodily, there's still quite a heaviness, stuckness. A split from the mind seems to create a split from emotion too. Why is this? So there's some things to unpack in here, one of which is, what is the definition of love for you, Paul? And that's where I would point you towards in some of your investigations. Love gets used in a lot of different ways, and I use it in a lot of different contexts. for tonight. If I say something like true love, what I'm talking about is that space of awareness that's pure acceptance. I am not talking about a feeling that feels good. So I just want to be very clear. When I say true love, that's what I mean. There's all kinds of aspects of human love, and we can experience that in all sorts of different ways. So if we're wondering why that experience hasn't come in, it's because that's not necessary to the space of pure acceptance, pure awareness. That is true love doesn't have a feeling. It's just there and allows everything as is, right? So it's unconditionally accepting, never resisting. So in that sense, that love is already here. So it's just like space, like it's already here. And if you want to notice it, then you just get quiet. If there's still a heaviness and stuckness, I would say that there's some more exploring to do with your own inner work in terms of like, what am I holding on to emotionally? I mean, what I'm not talking about is some sort of dissociation where we feel cut off from emotions. If that's happening, that's something else. That's a kind of running away. Just being the observer does not stop emotion. Emotion keeps kind of coming and flowing. And sometimes it flows more viscerally and regularly when we're just being the observer. So I think, the answer I'm gradually building towards here intuitively, Paul, is, it's time to kind of step back and just kind of observe and see if there's actually resistance happening, if there's a pushing away of experience happening at some level, or if there's an expectation of experience that's getting in the way, because sometimes our expectations are really problematic. And that's why I was explaining how I talk about love. With true love, it's not a feeling. It's always there just because it is. And it doesn't push anything away. So if we're feeling numb or disconnected in some way, that's a suggestion that there's a block going on and we want to investigate. Are we hiding from emotions? And that usually means we're hiding from uncomfortable emotions. And as another note, if anybody is using lots of different substances, whether it's ranging from caffeine and sugar all the way over to more hard drugs, that's going to screw up your feelings in your body. Your body is not being regulated in the way it should be. And so a lot of us do certain cleanses. It doesn't have to be anything extreme. Just eat regular. Regular meaning balanced, lots of vegetables, these types of things, and sleep well. And your body will re-regulate itself so you can start to feel. A lot of people are in really, really unhealthy states. So that also is part of a numbing that we do to ourselves so that we don't feel uncomfortable feelings. So it's its own sort of act of, I don't know if dissociating, but just suppression that we do. So that was kind of a long answer, but hopefully that's helpful, Paul. Let me know if you have follow-ups. From Nancy, if you're projecting egoic issues onto others, how would you catch yourself before going too far? And that's just kind of a hard question for me to answer because just to me at this point it's so obvious that if I'm thinking somebody should be a certain way or do a certain thing or I don't like what they're doing, that's all egoic. Maybe there's a follow-up you could give, Nancy, to help me understand a little bit more about what you mean, like a specific example without being too specific to anybody in your life. But yeah, I mean, just staying the observer, you get really clear how often you project onto other people. Another question is, how should I react to family members when they typecast you negatively? Stay as awareness. You don't need to react, right? Unless there's a situation where there's something that actually needs to be done. A lot of times there isn't. You just breathe, relax the body, and stay as awareness. You can watch your own reaction to not liking what they're saying. That's more important, really. So long as things aren't abusive in the sense that somebody is going to physically hurt you or themselves, right? These sort of near and present dangers I mentioned earlier. Most of the stuff that comes out of people's mouths is just words, and we don't actually have to respond. And the parts of us that do want to respond are part of the suffering. That's part of the ego that's trying to get approval, avoid, censure or emotional pain of some kind. But of course, the emotional pain is caused by us. As many of you heard me say over and over again, we choose our feelings. That's what makes us suffer. It's like when somebody says 5 kind words, the ego decides, oh, I should feel good. And then when they say 5 other words, then the ego tells us we should feel bad. This is bondage. This is being attached and suffering. So just observe. If family members want to create these different beliefs about you, you can watch it And the more you watch that, that usually creates greater compassion and humility, because you probably were doing the same thing for a lot of your life too. Seriously, this path makes all of us really, really humble. If you see somebody doing something you don't like, you probably were doing that at one point, or you're still doing that. And so we want to dissolve and resolve the issues within ourselves. Otherwise, we have no right to try and tell other people what to do. We can't even show them how to do it, right? And if other people don't get a model, don't get some example that they can see, they're not going to change. This is why all of your work, everybody listening tonight and those who will be listening to the recording, your work is so important. Go within and dissolve your ego, your issues. Let this split from the ego expand until it dissolves into this quiet, into spaciousness, into true love. And then you can show people by your being and by how you interact in life what a different option is. This is just so fundamental to this whole thing of humanity. People want this to be a time of great awakening and change and whatever. But if we don't set up ourselves as examples and follow this path to show other people what this even looks like, then all this other stuff is just a bunch of nonsense. We're just trying to self-insulate with a new set of spiritual ideas to make ourselves feel better about an unsafe world. And we're going to all act out from very unconscious spaces and try and impose our beliefs on others. And that's not this path. So each and every one of you is important. And I'm just here trying to be a model in a certain way to say, like, see, this isn't made up. You can dissolve ego. I won't say I'm perfect or completely free of all attachments. But what I can say is you keep getting clearer the more you stay in awareness. And that seems to amplify all of our ability to touch compassionately, touch with humility and humanity. And I think that's exceptionally important right now. So maybe that was a tangent for the last question, but I hope that helps. From Marta, does resistance to that cause physical discomfort? I feel like the more I try to relax into it, the worse the electrical charge intensifies. No, it doesn't cause physical discomfort, but imagine that relaxation is like opening a dam. So as the dam opens, more water comes. The more water comes, the more it hits other blocks and rocks in the river, right? So now you start to feel more. Now the tendency, and what you're asking me about, is to blame the water. Say, if this water wasn't here, I wouldn't feel it. It's like, and that's partially true, except for the rocks and the blocks are already there. So all these different fears and desires that got stuck, situations you didn't fully embrace and you held on to the pain that got stuck, those are the rocks. And when nothing is flowing over them, they're just there and we don't realize it. Once water starts flowing over them, we start to feel that friction internally. So this is not a sign that anything's going bad. And I recommend reading another blog post I recently updated. And it's the only must read I have on my blog. It's under the awakening section, called The Process of Healing Pain from Your Energy Body, or something like that. And that talks about this, how things will start to get worse, get more intense, and then something breaks, and then there's expansion, and for a while you're going to feel kind of good, and then the next set of rocks kind of get illuminated as the dam opens further. So each time we break down these rocks and these issues, things open up further and further, and we have more energy that can push and start to dislodge these other things. So in the initial years after an awakening, we have a lot of that push, and that's a really, really helpful thing. But we're usually also too freaked out by being split from our ego and all these new sensations that we don't really manage it very well. And so if you think of life as a big field, and you like flood that field, but you haven't, tilled the land, planted the seeds, and created roads to catch the water, then it just kind of washes over the thing. And some stuff will get uprooted, and some stuff will land and get grown, but it makes a kind of funky mess for a lot of people. So if you're early on, Marta, I just encourage you to see this as an amazing opportunity to hoe some rows as quick as you can and start working on some of the rocks, because then that will actually make it easier on you. What will make it worse and what adds to physical discomfort. So you've got this flow going over, but then there becomes this sort of resistance where he's trying to push back the river, and that retards the process of dissolving these issues and gets people in some really nasty places. It makes it very, very upsetting, to say the least. So let me know if that's helpful. So Nancy is following up. Sometimes I find myself falling back into unconsciousness, and then the ego tries to justify itself as consciousness, and that confuses me. It's like, which voice is the correct one? No voice is the correct one. Go to the awareness. The awareness isn't in a voice. And if some sort of justification is going on, then you start to look at that. It's like, what is this part of me that's trying to justify this whole experience, or this change or backslide or whatever? And that's part of the honesty we have with ourselves. Nancy was like, okay, I know this game. My ego doesn't want to admit that I'm scared of something and wants to find a way to intellectually outfox reality. So I'm going to take this position that everything is consciousness, so I can't do anything wrong, right? Which is partially true. It's one of the many ultimate truths that people try and get to without really realizing them. Any truth that's only intellectually understood is not a true spiritual truth. It's now become this very strange half-truth, and people try to do this a lot because it's scary to break down the ego. And there are different times where we'll get more scared than others. We're like, sometimes the initial split with an ego, like, will feel good to some people, and they'll be good, and they'll keep widening, and then they'll get here, whatever here is. And maybe it's a big validation issue, and then it gets scary. Or maybe it's out here, and then it gets scary, and then the tendency to pull back in, to go back into some place that appears to be safer, gets really strong. Anytime you feel that pull back towards unconsciousness, it's an opportunity to be aware. Slow everything down. Use your breath to slow down, because the body will tend to get tense because the ego is getting scared. And that's one of the ways that the ego controls us, right? Fear is not just an idea. It's a biochemical response in our bodies. There's tension, there's all sorts of things. So breathing and relaxing is one of the ways we start to break the power of the ego's fear. And we say, okay, what's happening here? We stay curious, and we investigate. But ultimately, there's not a voice to awareness, and that's important to remember. It doesn't tell you what to do. Thanks for the follow-up. Jen's asking, how do we know when our ego is completely dissolved? Well, if your ego is completely dissolved, you kind of don't care. But this kind of transition makes it clear that this is happening. And the truly conscious ego is just a lens we occasionally use that's useful. So you think of something very basic like, oh, I'm hungry today. And you kind of intuitively and, more from an ego sense remember that, oh, carrots make me feel good, and you go eat that. So this is a very benign way to talk about the conscious ego, but that's when we know it's a tool and we can put it down. The unconscious ego, we don't realize we have it, and we don't really fully understand how deeply embedded it is in us. So that's part of the reason the whole self-inquiry is so important. So we're reacting unconsciously. We don't know what we're doing or why we're doing it. And so that breaks down and goes away. And then you kind of have this other very, very light shell. So it's like some clothing you put on, but you know you're wearing it, and it's going to be temporary. That's not going to become part of an identity that you hold on to the rest of your life. And so in that way, ego ultimately becomes not that big of a deal. And when it's completely dissolved, there's just no real desire to even care about such a thing, because the ego would be the one that would care. Ultimately, it's not necessarily a question that we would even think to ask the further we go. So the important part is to pay attention to the work that's required of us now. And that's something I like to emphasize a lot, that what matters is appreciating wherever we are now, not trying to guess what it's like in the future or if we'll have succeeded, because that's coming from the ego self right now. That's projecting ideas onto the future about what it should know or what it needs to know. Everything that you need to know about your development is here right now. Some of it you'll like and some of it you won't, and that's still part of being honest. Thanks everyone for the questions so far. Let me know if anyone has follow-ups, and if you haven't asked a question, please feel free to do so. And also, if you're just joining, I'm Jim Tolles, and I blog at spiritualawakeningprocess.com if you want to catch up with more of my stuff. And if you've missed any part of this recording, it automatically uploads to my channel. And if you want to support, there's a donation link down below. Nancy is laughing. She says that intellectually outfox reality, exactly what the ego does all the time. Thanks for the clarification. Yeah, but the good thing is I think you're getting wise to it, right? Right, so like, you know, the ego is trying to outfox things, but you're starting to outfox the ego itself. It's like, oh, I know this game. Okay, so we're going to try and do this little intellectual ninjutsu to get around a reality I don't like and try to make myself feel good about myself and say I'm still conscious, right? So you just start to see this game and you just watch it. Don't fight it. That's a big thing with these ego splits, because there's a tendency too for some people, they want to fight it. It's like, oh, I got to push this away. I got to beat up the ego. I got to destroy it and mash it and do all sorts of stuff to it and put it in a blender. And that's not the thing, because that would just be creating another ego that's very destructive on yourself. And that creates all kinds of mental strife, to say the least. You'll notice the space of awareness doesn't put any strife on you. If there's already strife happening, that was kind of already there. And in the example of the awakening question that Marta posed earlier, yeah, there's pressure to that energy being opened up. But that pressure, goes away as we dissolve the blocks. So then it just becomes flow. So the end of that metaphor that I was kind of breaking open and explaining to Marta was, we start where there's no water flowing through the riverbed. So all of our issues are not being pressurized, so we don't realize they're there. Then the dam opens, and now there's pressure, and water is frothing and foaming and hitting the rocks. And so we really feel that, and it feels terrible. But as we dissolve and we let go and we keep surrendering, then the river just starts to flow more smoothly because it's unimpeded. But the way that feels is so different than when there's nothing flowing, when the riverbed is dry. And that's just something I can only point to, because when you're there, you'll know, and you'll know what I'm talking about, but there's no way I can explain it beyond pointing to that as a metaphor of the reality that emerges. But at the same time, awareness observes all three states. So if you haven't had any sort of awakening, don't worry about it. Just come to awareness and things will start to open themselves for you. And you observe when nothing is flowing, when that friction is happening, and when there's an ease in the flow. And awareness is there all the time. So you're never separate from that. Jen has a follow-up. Thanks, Jim. I'm asking because the dissolving process is difficult, and I'm wondering if the pain of it will end. Been dissolving for about 6 years now. It's not so bad now. Well, whenever it's difficult, we really do have to keep looking for, where is the difficulty? Is this some old block from past pain that we're holding on to somewhere in our emotional body, our physical body, our intellectual body, our energy body? And how much are we still resisting in general? That a part of us is just trying to get through. So some of the more subtle games, I have a video called 7 Ego Tricks to watch out for. I don't remember if I mentioned these, but waiting and trying to get through something are 2 ego games that go on. So waiting is, in a sense, we don't want to be where we are. And it's a powerful thing to really fully be present to whatever the difficulty that's coming up. And that's really important, because that's actually what accelerates the dissolving. But the waiting mentality doesn't work because we just don't fully want to be there. And the more you can just be where you are, whether it's painful or not, the more things can arise and move on their own intelligently. You can't outfox it, like Nancy and I are talking. This isn't way, well, Jim says, just be here more, so I'm going to try and be here more. Right? We do very, very strange things at times to try and get ourselves out of pain. Coming into a deep surrender of pain is a powerful, powerful lesson, because pain is ultimately part of life. And then there's the trying to get through thing that happens for some of the spiritual workaholics. That's another topic on the blog. So afterwards you can go to spiritualawakeningprocess.com, just search spiritual workaholics, and I outline some of that. And they're trying to power their way through their ego again now. And once again, it's still a rejection of where they are. They're trying to get away from this moment they don't like to get to another. And that's not being here now. So I empathize, I know about the pain of dissolving the ego and all the nasty ways it holds on, because even if we surrender, Jen, even if we surrender completely consciously, what you end up realizing is how much of you is unconsciously not surrendering. And that's why we have to go as much as we can consciously, intentionally, to say, no, I fully surrender. So we can get to these unconscious parts. They're like, nope, not doing it. Don't like this spiritual thing. No way. No, thank you. Let's go. Can I get out of this now? Right? That part of us is very real. And we're going to talk to that part of us and the body that's hanging out in the energy, that's hanging out in those different subtle ways through a lot of relaxation and a lot of resilience and dedication to just be with the moment. And then gradually, another part of you will surrender a little bit more. And you'll be like, oh, wow, I didn't even know I was this tense. I didn't know I was holding on. And I have seen that myself, and I've seen that in so many students so many times. There's so much we don't know about ourselves. And so we do the best we can to surrender as fully as we can. So we can start to find the rest of us that's like, nope, not into this. Nancy's following up saying, yes, agreed, bashing the ego would create more fragmentation within ourselves, I've noticed. Yeah, exactly, right? Because now you're creating another ego to face off the original ego. And it's a mess. What other questions do people have? Appreciate everybody's questions and comments tonight. We've got about 10 minutes left. We really aren't at war with the ego. That's such an important part to reemphasize, that when we're going to that space of awareness, that's not in resistance or at war with anything. Marta's asking, what about using psychedelics and what they say about psychedelics instigating ego death? I stay away from them as much as possible, and that's what I recommend to everybody else, because I want you to have conscious, intentional guidance to your own work. Some of those things end up being starters for a lot of people to kind of jump over the barriers of their ego and to jump over their barriers of their other blocks and karma and whatever else is in there. But from a long-term perspective, it's not necessary, and it's disempowering because you're putting your power in another thing, another substance, rather than going within yourself. When you can break down your own blocks intentionally and work through things and trust your own energy, that's a very empowering thing. And so that's where I generally point people towards, is all this sort of inner work that we can do on our own in completely clear-minded states is powerful. And particularly if awakening's already started, you've got the most intelligent thing happening for you, so don't gum it up with something else. A lot of times people will actually be going through purification phases initially on those awakening years, and their food and diet changes rather radically because the body wants to reorient itself and kind of reset itself. Sometimes a lot of those first years really is just resetting. We're not even really doing any deep work. We're trying to clear out the body of certain amounts of junk, and that includes physical stuff because there's a lot of terrible food that we've put inside ourselves. And resetting and sleep. So sleep, meditation is a great rest tool in general. Meditation has a lot of different layers, but just these are the ways that our body often needs to reset itself so that it's stable enough to handle more intensity. Usually the first time we have any sort of spiritual experience, that seems like the most intense thing we've ever had, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. We're not really set up, most of us, to deal with a lot of inner intensity. So yeah, we clear out as much junk and stuff as possible so that you can listen to you. And additionally, these other substances mask and distort our abilities to perceive. Or they can amplify it to things that we're not ready to see. So there's a much more natural and intelligent way inside us. When awakened energy moves on its own, it's already here. If it's not moving on its own, there's plenty of other tools to help start to kind of build things up and to clear things out so that you can gently and in a way that you can integrate, move through things. And that's just so important because plenty of people move into things they're not ready to integrate, and they can get blasted apart into strange different spaces, cause deep psychological problems. And that has to be respected. This path, to really move towards spiritual freedom must be respected. And I feel like in a lot of ways, it's become a new toy. This is serious business to dissolve the ego. So those are some thoughts on that. Any other last questions? Or if somebody hasn't asked a question, please feel welcome to do so. And if you don't feel comfortable here, I have a contact page on my blog. You can just leave a message there if you wanted to ask a question. And 2 weeks from now, as I said, then I'll be doing another talk, and I'll be talking about how to be your new spiritual self. And there'll be an announcement for that particular talk that'll go up on the blog as well. Marta says, meditation seems to make the electrical pain I'm having worse. What other tips you got for digging up those blocks? No, that's good, though. If the pain's getting worse, it means they are being dug up. I know exactly what you're talking about. On the first year after awakening, I would sit and meditate and just pour sweat. You know, it was not relaxing to me. It was just like, pff, I'd be like shirtless in my underwear pouring sweat. There's tons of stuff on my blog, Marta, that I would recommend, get into, maybe starting with the starting out section and things like that. But, the what is spiritual inner work, that's a good blog post to look for. And just the way we turn our attention inwards to see like, well, where is the pain? So sourcing the pain, is it holding on to my chest? Is it my head? Is it my neck? Right? The body is very honest about where things are stuck. So we use the honesty of the body to help find these different blocks. And then just focus on one block at a time and breathe into it. And even if you're breathing into, let's say, your knees, right? Obviously, our lungs aren't in our knees. The intention is to relax the body, to allow something that's difficult and painful to come up, when our general tendency is to clench when we feel something that's painful. So going against that tendency to want to clench against something that's painful is key, so things can kind of arise. And then you have to trust whatever comes up. So if it's a memory that you don't like, that's what's going to be stuck in us most of the time, Marta, is that we're going to find the stuff we didn't like and we didn't want to deal with and we tried to push away. And we're going to find out that we didn't succeed. And all that stuff stayed with us. And so that's the stuff that usually comes out. Every now and then somebody's been repressing a whole bunch of giggles and joy. And that's fun. I enjoy those sessions as much as the next spiritual teacher. But most of the other time, that's not what's coming out of people. That's not what they're really attached to. And it's a funny thing to say how attached we are to our pain, but we are. We're attached to avoiding it. And so that keeps it stuck. So I just encourage you to have courage. So when you're meditating and stuff is getting more intense, breathe and relax more. And if there's a particular area that you can focus on that has the most pain, breathe and relax into that specifically. So I think those are my thoughts for tonight. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for those who donated. There are more links, donation button, an ebook down in the comments below here that you can check out afterwards. And as I said, there'll be another talk coming up. And for those who are brand new to me, I also do sessions one-on-one through Skype. So I hope this has been helpful, and I hope everybody has a beautiful day, morning or night. Bye.